Have you ever thought about like the journey of a drug?
Yeah.
From like a tiny little bit of powder in the lab to like, you know, a pill that you might take. It's kind of amazing when you think about it.
Oh, yeah, for sure. People get really excited about those like big breakthrough moments, when a new drug is discovered.
Yeah.
And that's totally understandable. But there's this whole other phase that's well, it's not as glamorous, but it's just as important. It's taking that tiny little molecule and figuring out how to make enough of it to actually help people.
Right. So it's not just about the science, it's also like a massive engineering challenge, right?
Absolutely. You're basically going from like a small kitchen experiment to something like a giant food factory.
Right. Yeah.
It's a huge jump in scale.
And for this deep dive, you've gathered a bunch of material, like from all these different angles. We've got stuff on the initial, like hurdles in developing the drug, and then all the crazy details of how they actually manufacture it, and even like the whole regulatory side of things. It's pretty comprehensive.
Yeah, I tried to cover all the bases. What we're really trying to do here is like break down the key concepts and show you like what are the big challenges that come up when you try to scale up production of a new drug. It's going from making like milligrams in a lab to kilograms or even tons in a factory.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. We've got this like magical image of a scientist in a lab creating a brand new molecule, right?
Yeah, kind of like that. Drug discovery almost always starts with making a new chemical entity. We call it an NCE for short.
Hmm.
And we actually get to see a little bit of that in the sources. Like one of the articles describes the synthesis of this pretty complex molecule. It's called, get this, 5-chloro-2-methoxyphenol 3-fluoro-5-trifluoromethyl-phenylmethanone 7.
Wow, that's a mouthful.
Right. And then there's another one that mentions buck-melflufen. These are like the first real versions of a potential drug, and they're made using these really carefully planned out chemical reactions.
So they have these like small scale methods that work in the lab. Can't they just like make the experiments bigger? Just, multiply everything.
You'd think so, right? It sounds like it should be that easy, but things get tricky when you try to scale things up. Those initial ways of making the drug, they're fine for making small amounts for research, but when you try to do it on a factory scale, you run into problems. Think about it like this. You have a recipe for, say, a really delicate cake. It might turn out perfect in your kitchen, but if you try to make 1,000 of them in a giant bakery oven without changing anything, it's probably going to be a disaster.
I see what you mean. So it's not just about making more of the stuff. It's about like changing the recipe itself to work on a larger scale.
Exactly. And that's where a whole bunch of factors come in, like how much of the drug you actually get from the starting materials. That's called the yield and the cost of all the ingredients. And you have to think about safety too, because handling large amounts of chemicals can be risky.
Right, that makes sense. So it's not just about creating the molecule. It's about figuring out the most efficient and safe way to manufacture it in huge amounts.
Yeah, it's like turning a cool science experiment into a reliable and efficient factory process. And that brings us to some key concepts in manufacturing. Have you ever heard of process chemistry?
I can't say I have, but it sounds intriguing.
So it's like the art of taking something that works in a lab and making it work in a factory. It's not just finding any way to make the molecule, it's finding the best way. The safest, the cheapest, the one that gives you the most drug with the least waste. One of our sources talked about how they optimized the synthesis of this thing called R3-amino 6-caro-D-fluorochroman 2, and they had to make kilograms of it. That's process chemistry in action.
Optimization. So it's like fine-tuning every step, but with a focus on industrial production. What exactly are they tweaking?
Lots of things. First off, they need to think about where they're going to get all the starting materials and how much they're going to cost. If the ingredients are rare or super expensive, it's going to make the final drug really expensive, and that's a big problem. Then there's the issue of waste. A lab experiment might produce a tiny amount of byproduct, but a factory could make tons of it, and some of that stuff can be pretty nasty. So they're always looking for ways to minimize waste and make the whole process more environmentally friendly.
Okay, so we've got this shift from the lab to the factory. What are some of the big challenges that pop up during this scale-up?
Oh, there are a bunch. Yield and purity are big ones. In the lab, it's easier to control things, so you get more of the drug and it's purer. But when you scale up, things change, like how well things mix together or how the heat is distributed. That can really mess with your yield and make the drug less pure. There's this example in one of the articles about melflufen HCl, and the initial yield was only 32%. That's not enough to make a commercially viable drug, so they had to get in there and figure out what was going wrong and optimize each step.
32%. Wow, that's a huge difference. What are the challenges do they face?
Well, safety is a big one. When you're dealing with large amounts of chemicals, things can get dangerous. Some of these chemicals are flammable, corrosive, or even toxic. So they have to build special facilities with all these safety features like negative pressure systems and HEPA filters to protect the workers and prevent anything from leaking out into the environment.
So it's a big step up in terms of infrastructure.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And then you've got process optimization itself. What works perfectly in a small flask in the lab might not work at all in a giant reactor. It's like trying to bake that cake in a totally different oven. One example is where they had to switch the solvent they were using, like going from dichloromethane, that's CH2Cl2 for short, to tetrahydrofuran, or THF. And then there's another example where they had to be super careful about which base they used in a Suzuki coupling reaction. These little changes can make a big difference.
Wow, I wouldn't have thought that changing a solvent could have such a huge impact.
It can be surprising, right?
Yeah.
And then there's the whole issue of isolating and purifying the drug after the reaction is done. They use techniques like crystallization, filtration, and distillation, but scaling those up can cause problems. One article talked about how they were using a continuous flow reactor, and the product kept precipitating out and clogging the equipment. So even separating the good stuff from the bad stuff becomes a whole engineering challenge.
Yeah, so many things to consider. What about making sure that every batch of the drug is the same and meets the quality standards?
Yeah, that's super important. They call it reproducibility and quality control. You can't have one batch that's super potent and another that's weak. So there are all these strict rules and regulations that they have to follow. And they have entire teams of people whose job is just to make sure that everything is done perfectly.
So it's not just about the science, it's also about all these regulations.
Absolutely. The pharmaceutical industry is one of the most heavily regulated industries out there. They have to make sure everything is documented. They have to follow specific procedures, and every batch of the drug has to be tested to make sure it meets the standards.
You mentioned some real-world examples from this journal called OPR&D. I think it stands for Organic Process Research and Development, right?
Yeah, that's the one. It's full of these case studies that show how researchers solve these scale-up problems. For example, there's one article where they talk about making R3-amino 6-fura-8-difluorochroman, which is like a building block for a drug. They managed to do something called telescoping, where they combine multiple steps into one. It's kind of like doing a bunch of cooking steps in the same pot to save time. They did this to improve the efficiency and reduce waste, but it required a ton of optimization, especially for this one step called ketone reduction.
Telescoping, that's a neat trick.
Yeah, it is. But you have to be really careful because the conditions for each step have to work with the next one. There's another cool example where they had to scale up these reactions called acetylation and nitration. They were making an intermediate for osimertinib, which is a lung cancer drug. Nitration reactions can be really dangerous because they can explode if you're not careful. So they use this technology called continuous flow, where the reaction happens in a tiny stream, which makes it much safer and more efficient.
So it's like a controlled stream instead of a big batch, which makes sense for safety.
Yeah, exactly. And they also talk a lot about optimizing Suzuki coupling, that reaction I mentioned before for connecting carbon atoms. They experiment with different solvents like THF and dioxane and different bases like potassium acetate and sodium carbonate to get the best results. It's like a puzzle, figuring out the perfect combination of ingredients and conditions.
Right. It's all about finding the perfect balance.
Absolutely. And then after all the reactions are done, they have to purify the drug. They often use crystallization for that, where they basically grow crystals of the drug. And they have to be super precise with the conditions, like the solvent, the temperature, and even adding tiny seed crystals to start the process.
So they're not just chemists, they're like crystal growers too.
You could say that. They're controlling matter at a molecular level to get the pure drug. And all of this, like we talked about before, has to be done under strict regulations to ensure the safety and quality of the final product.
Wow. This deep dive has been a real eye-opener. I had no idea how much went into making a drug.
It's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it. Taking a drug from a tiny speck in a lab to a pill that millions of people can take is a huge accomplishment. It involves so much science, engineering, and meticulous planning.
Yeah, and it makes you appreciate that little pill a lot more, knowing all the work that went into it.
For sure. And it also brings up another interesting point. Since they're making so much of these drugs, we have to think about the environmental impact. There's a whole field of research dedicated to making these processes greener and more sustainable. They even mention greener fluorination in one of the articles, which is pretty cool.
Right. Sustainability is such an important issue these days.
Absolutely. It's all connected. So that's the journey of a drug in a nutshell. From a tiny molecule in a lab to a life-saving medicine. It's a long and complex process, but it's one that's absolutely crucial for human health.
This deep dive has been truly fascinating. Thanks for taking us on this journey.
My pleasure. There's so much more we could talk about, but I hope this has given you a good overview of the challenges and triumphs of drug manufacturing.
It certainly has.
Yeah.
And for our listeners, if you're interested in learning more, I encourage you to dive into some of the resources we mentioned. It's a fascinating world out there.
Agreed. There's always something new to discover.